Hello and welcome to part 2 of this video series on exposure. In this video we're going to be looking at the exposure triangle, and in particular I want to present a new way of thinking about the exposure triangle, which I think will make your photography out in the field a lot simpler and a lot easier. And if you stick around to the end, I'm going to give you a quick tip on how to set up your overexposure warning on your camera so that it's optimized for RAW files and you can be sure of nailing your exposure when you're out in the field. So when I'm thinking about shutter speed, aperture and ISO, I'm thinking about image intent and image quality first and foremost. And exposure is important, but I think to myself, what is the most critical camera setting for this situation? For example, if I want to blur clouds or moving water, then I'm going to need a slow shutter speed, and for that I'll need a tripod, a remote release, and possibly even a neutral density filter. And if I was going for shallow depth of field, well then I need to prioritize aperture. So let's go through a thought exercise from a recent photo trip to the Molesworth. I've arrived on a hillside at dawn. It's very dim, so straight away I'm thinking slow shutter speed. And this means I can pick whatever's optimal for aperture or ISO, and I'm going to pick a mid-range aperture because lenses tend to be their sharpest around the middle of the range, something like f5.6 or 8. And I'll also pick 100 ISO because most modern cameras are optimized to produce the best image quality at around 100 ISO. And then the shutter speed can fall to whatever it needs to, and it could be 2 seconds, it could be 30 seconds. It's not going to make any difference to the image quality. So then my decision simply becomes, how can I get my desired exposure at f8 100 ISO? Because whether I end up at 2 seconds or 30 seconds, it doesn't matter to the image quality, it's still going to be good. So here's my hierarchy of thinking on my arrival at the scene. So it's quite dim light, I'm going to have to pick a slow shutter speed, therefore I need a tripod. Number 2, do I want to shoot a panorama? If so, I need to set up a level base on the tripod. Number 3, set the aperture at f8 and the ISO at 100, optimal settings for image quality. Number 4, look at the histogram on the back of the camera in order to judge the correct exposure and set my shutter speed accordingly. And number 5, use my remote release to trigger the shutter so I don't introduce any camera shake. And I always leave my ISO setting till last, and that's because there's very few reasons why you'd want to move your ISO away from 100, because that's the optimal quality. The only reason I can see for wanting to introduce grain and loss of image quality would be if you're wanting to emulate film, and you're better off doing that with a plugin like Enhancer. The basic exposure principle's actually quite simple. If you take away from one point of the triangle, then you need to add that same amount of exposure to another point of the triangle. So that part of the equation you could even have controlled in an automatic exposure mode. So in conclusion, I think it's easier to think of exposure in terms of hierarchy. What's most important, shutter speed or aperture? So optimize one of those and then adjust your aperture and your ISO until your exposure is correct. I think if you think of it in this way, in a hierarchical sense rather than a triangular sense, it becomes much easier in the field. And then with regards to getting your exposure correct, if you evaluate the histogram and provided that's falling within the acceptable range, then you're good to go. The histogram on the back of the camera is independent of whatever exposure mode you're in, whether it's manual or automatic, and independent of the metering mode. It could be on multi, it could be on center-weighted average, it doesn't matter. The histogram will still give you a good indication of whether your exposure is acceptable. So when I'm getting set up to take a photo, these are the sorts of things I'm thinking about. Do I need a tripod because I've got quite a slow shutter speed, and therefore do I need a remote release? Do I need a lens hood in case I'm getting sun flare or lens flare? Or do I need to shade the camera lens with my hand? And if I'm hand holding the camera because I haven't got a tripod, is the shutter speed high enough to avoid camera shake? And closely related to that is the focal length, which affects the shutter speed I'll need to avoid camera shake. Or is my point of focus a critical factor because my depth of field is quite shallow, so I need to be very clear what the lens is focused on? So rather than thinking about the exposure triangle as such, I'm thinking about what's most important for this scene that's in front of me and the cascading effects of that decision. So here's my bonus tip regarding adjusting the highlight exposure warning. On Sony cameras, it's called the zebra display, and I've got it set up in my function menu, so I can turn that on or off. When it's on, if the image is overexposed, I can see those zebra markings, and I just simply adjust the exposure until they disappear. Now, I've got this set up specifically for RAW files, and I'll show you how I set that up. So rather than setting up at one of these standard settings where the zebra markings come in at a certain percentage, I've got it set up as a custom setting, and the advantage of this is I can set it to either lower limit or standard plus range. Now, I haven't got it set to standard plus range because the zebra markings kick in a lot sooner and stay later, and I only really want the zebra markings to kick in when I'm definitely overexposed. So I've got it set to lower limit, and rather than 100%, I've got it 107, because from experimentation I've found that that is ample for me to recover any highlight detail in a RAW file. So with that set, then it's simply a matter of adjusting the exposure either through aperture, shutter speed or ISO, and just double checking the histogram that it's where I expect it to be, and I'm good to go. So it's very easy to see at a glance whether I've got those highlights when I'm out in the field. And in the next video I want to cover RAW versus JPEG because there are important exposure considerations when you're shooting either of these formats. So hopefully that's made things a little bit clearer and given you some guidelines for making decisions in the field. And to finish up with today, I want to show you a time lapse I took on this trip to the Molesworth. I had the time lapse set to run overnight, and it was running on an automatic program that first of all adjusted the shutter speed, and then when it reached the limit of the shutter speed, it started adjusting the aperture. And then when the aperture got to wide open, which was 1.4, very wide, then it moved on to ISO and raised the ISO. So by the time it's completely dark, the image quality has dropped right off because the ISO is high, so it's quite a noisy image. The depth of field is very shallow, so the stars are in focus, but the foreground's a little bit fuzzy. But by going through that hierarchy of shutter speed, aperture, and then ISO, I can optimize the best possible quality of the image at the particular time given the conditions. And a special shout out to James O'Day, a photographer from Hamner who I met on the road in the Molesworth. He gave me a heads up that an aurora was happening, which I did actually manage to capture in the time lapse, and also he gave me some good advice about which direction that it would be most visible. So thanks James. His links are in the description. Thanks for watching. I hope to see you in the next one.